That's all. Okay, we're good.
Our speaker today is Neil Buhne. Neil grew up in Windsor. He was introduced to Unitarian Universalism through his parents when he was 6 and has remained linked to UU since then, including being married in this church almost exactly 36 years ago, 4th of April, 1987. Neil was educated at the University of Windsor and did graduate work at Carleton before beginning his 37-year-long career with the United Nations. His first posting was in Sri Lanka. Through his years with the UN, Neil focused on serving people through work at the country level. His long career took him to many countries, including Sri Lanka, Thailand, Pakistan, Bulgaria, Belarus, and Bhutan in a variety of leadership roles. He retired from the UN on the 31st of December, 2021. He is currently a professor of practice at McGill University in Montreal and a research associate at the Geneva Graduate Institute for International Affairs and Development. Neil is a Canadian from Windsor, where his parents, Emil and Eunice, still live, and we're honored today to have Emil in the congregation. For the last 4 years, he is also a Swiss national, and he and his wife, Sonia, live most of the time in a small village in the Alps of eastern Switzerland. Sonia, who worked for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Sudan and Pakistan. They have 2 sons who are graduates of McGill and the Geneva Graduate Institute for International Affairs and Development. Neil's talk is entitled Shared Values and/or Faith, Conflict Maker or Confidence Builder. Reflections from personal experience with the United Nations in about a dozen countries. Neil.
Let me see if the microphone is on. I think so. Thank you very much. And first, a technical salute to the congregation. I know from my meetings with the UN, even things involving the Secretary General, that hybrid meetings are the hardest thing to do. And the fact that the small Olinda congregation has managed to do it so successfully for so long, and I'm benefiting from it, is wonderful. I also wanted to thank Ray and Bill for the musical selection and the readings today. The T.S. Eliot reading in particular touched me because, as Ray mentioned, I mean, on the first Saturday of April in 1987, my wife and I were married here. My father was here. My sister, who's on the screen up there, was also attending. There weren't too many other people. And we selected our own music. And one of the pieces we concluded with was a piece by Stan Rogers that you might know called The Northwest Passage, which is fundamentally about going out and exploring and coming back home. And that's what the T.S. Eliot piece was about. So that's a very nice, good karma moment to bring that together. But when I was asked to speak, I was thinking what would be interesting for people. And going back to Windsor, Ontario Unitarian Fellowship on Dougal Road, I think, if I'm right, Dad, in the basement at Sunday school, people talked about religion and whether religion was a force for good, whether it might be a force for bad. So hence the title of whether it's, I should move back.
No, I just want to see that.
Okay.
We're good.
Whether religion is about, or shared values, are something that actually accentuate conflict maker, or is it something that builds confidence and builds peace? And of course, when you ask people, people have quite strong opinions about that. They'll say religion causes wars, or they'll say religion builds confidence. And if you look, especially over the last 20 years or so in North America, I mean, since the terrible events of 9/11 and then the invasion of Iraq and the whole rhetoric of the war on terrorism, the perception was that Islam was something that creates terrorism and creates conflict. I was living in Islamic countries for most of that time. I didn't agree, but that was the perception. When I arrived in Sri Lanka first in October 1984, it was about 10 months after there had been terrible ethnic riots in the country, in which Buddhist monks had actually helped incite people to attack Tamils who were either Hindu or Christian. So in that case, it looked like Buddhism was creating conflict. If you look in South Asia, where I lived much of my life, when there was the division of India, the partition, you had millions of people displaced, actually tens of millions of people displaced. Millions lost their lives because of Sikhs fighting Muslims, Muslims fighting Hindus, and you had the division of South Asia. So it looked like religion was a conflict maker there as well. And then, of course, in my father's country of birth, Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the 1990s, you had a terrible, terrible civil war, which pitted Muslim Bosnians against Serbian Orthodox Bosnians, against Catholic Christian Croatians. And religion seemed to have a base for the narrative that fed the war there. And even now in Ukraine, the sort of rhetoric which Vladimir Putin has used for the invasion is one of protecting Orthodox values against the corruption of modernizing liberal ideas. I think he uses the word liberal, coming in from the West. At the same time, when I was growing up, 1960s as a kid in Windsor in 1970s, I mean, religion was, and religions were quite strong in the critique of what was happening in Vietnam, and the American intervention, I think, was one of the forces that pushed eventually for that peace agreement, and which, after too many lives lost, mean that ordinary people in Vietnam have many more opportunities than they certainly had in the 1970s. If you look at other places, I think the best example is perhaps Northern Ireland, where the Good Friday Agreement on Good Friday was pushed very much by a coalition of Protestant and Catholic religious people, and they built confidence and built peace in Ireland, which is tremendously important. So what actually is the answer? Does faith, mainly through religions, create conflict, or does it build confidence? Does it build peace? So I'm going to focus on three particular religions, which I'm most familiar with, even though if my faiths come anywhere, they're closest to that of UUA, but that does come out of the Christian tradition as well. So I'll focus on the Christian set of beliefs, then Islam, because I've lived about 16 years of my life in predominantly Muslim countries. And then I'll also touch on Buddhism, because I've lived a lot of my life in Buddhist countries as well. But I feel, although I'm not going to talk in detail about Judaism or Sikhism or Confucianism, native sets of beliefs, a lot of these ideas would apply to that as well. So to start with, how has Christianity actually contributed to conflicts? Well, it's not actually what Jesus said, but I'll come back to that later. But very soon after, as Christianity became the religion of Rome, Emperor Constantine, Saint Augustine, great philosopher, basically started to use Christianity to justify violent actions. And then, of course, the most famous thing, the Crusades, where knights from Western Europe went to the Holy Land and to make it holy again and take it back from Muslims, but at the same time killed hundreds of thousands of people. And then, appropriately, as we discussed the discovery doctrine, the ideology of colonialism was grounded in papal doctrine, the ultimate sort of high seat of Christianity. And then, of course, I mentioned Bosnia recently. And if you go just 20 years ago back, in fact, almost exactly 20 years ago, the invasion of Iraq, led by George Bush and Tony Blair's inspiration, was very much using a language of religion and of fighting evil and bringing good. And I know when you have interviews with both of them, because they both were actually personally religious, both Blair and Bush, they did have this sort of almost messianic idea of applying the religion to conflict. So the case can be made that Christianity actually has contributed to a lot of terrible wars. On Islam, you can look at Muhammad. And Muhammad initially was a fairly ordinary guy, and then he had revelations. The revelations were fairly peaceful, and mystical, but as he lived longer, eventually he was part of a Muslim state, which he created within Arabia, largely peacefully. But soon after, Islam expanded. It expanded right to Spain, expanded to Central Asia, India, and in many cases, the religion was used for violent acts that forced the religion on people, with terrible things happening. And this idea of jihad, I won't go into detail because there's ideas of personal as well as external jihad, but it was used. You can make a case that it had a role in the partition of India, and then you can look at the role of religion, Islam, Judaism, in what's been happening in the Middle East. Albeit it's not so clear because the Palestinians who are going through such difficult times are not purely Muslim. Many of them are Christian as well. But nonetheless, there's a religious narrative often to the things that are happening, even the divisions in Israel right now that you're reading about. Buddhism and conflict. Now, people think of Buddhism and they think of the Dalai Lama, they think of meditation. If you look at the Buddha's sayings, it's completely the opposite about conflict to resolve issues. But even the Buddha, in his name is Prince Siddhartha, he had links to kings at that time, sort of 4,500 years ago, who drew power from using conflict. If you look at Asoka, who was the greatest Buddhist king who ruled a kingdom that stretched from Afghanistan to Southeast Asia and included all of India, I mean, he justified military action through Buddhism. And then coming personally, you probably don't know the name of this fellow, Dutugamanu. He lived in sort of the 13th century in Sri Lanka. He was a great king, and he banished the Tamils, some from India and some from within Sri Lanka because they've been living there. And he used Buddhism as the ideology for that banishment. I'm going to come back to that later. And he showed sorrow for killing Tamils, but he was assured by the monks that because the opponents were not Buddhists, their deaths were equivalent to those of beasts and equaled only 1/2 of a Buddhist person. In other words, he used violence as a means, he said, to create peace. Now, that's been used by all religions, not simply Buddhism, but that's a very eloquent expression of it. So a case can be made that religion causes conflicts. Holy war was a basic ingredient in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam, in Hinduism, in Buddhism. And, it can be exploited. But going back, if you actually look at the wars that, especially over the 20th century, and the late part of the 19th century, in which most people have died, religion was not so central to them. If you look at World War I, World War II, religion was not the driving force. There may have been elements, but it was not the driving force. If you look at the Chinese Civil War, sort of between 1940-49, between the communists and the nationalists, in which huge numbers of people died as well, that was ideological, not religious. If you look at the Sino-Japanese War, that was like 1930 to 1945, not religious. If you look at more recently, the Iran-Iraq War, which sort of goes under the radar, but which friends of mine were involved with when they were forced to serve on one of both sides. There's a certain Sunni Shia element to that, but not quite clearly because Iraq is also partly Shia. And of course, in North America, people are familiar with the Vietnam War, and that did not really have a religious element to it. You can argue, but it was not the key element. So overall, most people have died from wars. The people, if you look at wars and conflicts, the bulk of the deaths, the bulk of the damage to people's lives, the bulk of the damage to the environment has actually not been caused by religions, not religious wars justified on ideology, they justified on the basis of economy. And there are strong examples of religions playing a role in diffusing war. The Quaker tradition in Christianity, pugwash with respect to nuclear. If you're Canadian, you know about the pugwash movement. I mentioned the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. If you look at the sort of words of Jesus from the Bible, Jesus, did not fight. He died as a non-resistant. He forgave his crucifiers and advised love of enemy and martyrdom. He had no political office, rejected worldly power, offered no explicit political advice beyond paying taxes and the ambiguous, give unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar and unto God what belongs to God. They're not saying what belongs to each. If you go back to also the Balkans, I lived in Bulgaria, I also lived in Belarus altogether about 8 years. There's long traditions of people living together. And I'm going to intersperse, just so you don't hear me talking all the time as well, a little bit of music. And if Stuart, if you could play the first piece for about a minute, which is from Bulgaria, and I think is a symbol of how the traditional values of that region, how music that's inspired by spirit actually can bring people together. If that's possible, Stuart. Okay, thank you. I was trying to find a good, it's fantastic music. I mean, one of the fringe benefits of my job was I remember going in Bulgaria on, I think, the first visit I made to the Rhodope Mountains, to a small village where we had a project that was trying to reinvigorate a traditional Bulgarian institution that worked with libraries that had been sort of changed during the communist period to be just a cultural center. And I went outside and there was a bagpiper and actually a fairly young woman singing something very similar to that, not the whole choir, but a very similar mood. And it still moves me when I hear that music. But now to move to Islam, which has this tremendous bad image. And I thought of that last night, actually. I had a very complicated way getting here. I was supposed to come from Montreal yesterday, flying on Porter, leaving in the middle of the day, very relaxed. And both my flights got canceled. So I managed to get to Toronto about 2 hours earlier than I planned. But then my flight from Toronto to Windsor was canceled. So I had to scramble and I got the train. So I got the train and came in around 10 o'clock last night. And I called an Uber, and the Uber driver, I said, sounded familiar to me. And he was from Syria. And he was a refugee from Syria who'd come in the beginning of that period in 2014. And it made me think again of what a difficult time a lot of the refugees who came from Iraq, from Syria, from other places to live here had, because there was a feeling, less strong now, that somehow Islam, if you're Islamic, it breeds conflict and that you're a terrorist. He seemed to be doing all right, although not so great, because driving an Uber late on Friday night may not be what he had hoped to move here for. But to go the other side, Islam in all humanity, and this my Pakistani and Malaysian friends and Sudanese friends would say this, all humanity desires peace, because peace means submission to God, and doing so brings the believer peace. When the whole world submits to the rule of God as contained in the Quran, then the whole world is at peace. So that's the idea. Is peace is central to Islam. And if you look at Islam, you have different elements, but as it moved through Asia especially, I mean, what I'm familiar with in parts of Pakistan, and Islam I'm familiar with from Malaysia and Indonesia, was very much inspired more by the Sufi tradition, which is not aesthetic, not when you read about Saudi Arabia and this very, almost called Protestant type of Protestant type of Islam in a way, which has no symbols. These are very rich and very spiritual. And that's the type of Islam which actually promotes communities working together, a type of Islam which is traditional, and a type of Islam that I saw and experienced in Pakistan when I visited shrines there. And I have a little musical piece here by someone called Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, who arguably is the best known Pakistani musician of the last 40, 50 years. But he sings in the Sufi tradition, and he sings Qawwali. I've been fortunate that I actually saw him at someone's sort of wedding reception in a room with about 70 people. And that was one of the best musical experiences of my life. But these songs are religious, they're spiritual. I just wanted to illustrate it as how this is music that is about peace, not about conflict. So Stuart, the piece from Nusrat.
मेरा विरद है दम दम अली अली मेरा विरद है दम दम अली अली सखी लाल कलंदर मस्त मस्त सखी लाल कलंदर मस्त मस्त दूल्हे लाल कलंदर मस्त मस्त दम मस्त कलंदर मस्त मस्त दम मस्त कलंदर मस्त मेरा विरद है दम दम अली अली मेरा विरद है दम दम अली अली सखी लाल कलंदर मस्त मस्त सखी लाल कलंदर मस्त मस्त दूल्हे लाल कलंदर मस्त मस्त दम
It might be good to stop around here. Thank you. I mean, I hadn't realized that we could actually, with our hybrid, super hybrid way we do these, that you can actually see what's on from the YouTube clip, or I would have given a YouTube clip of him performing rather than the music. And that particular piece is a little bit hybrid. It was done with Peter Gabriel's group and has a bit of a Canadian musician, in fact, with some of the guitar work. But the song is fundamentally a qawwali. You could sit on the floor in Pakistan. In fact, I probably did listen to that song in Lahore in 1992 or so when I first heard it. But then I'll move on to Buddhism. I'm going to, as I said, zoom in on three: Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism. The Buddha taught non-killing and detachment, accepted no political office, and dismissed war as of no importance. Sorry. If you look current, I mean, the ultimate symbol, I mean, you could say saint in a way, well, that's using Christian terminology, of peace and nonviolence is the Dalai Lama, who's the leader of Tibetan Buddhism and has come under criticism, in fact, by other Tibetans for not being aggressive enough, for not advocating violent means, but he's stuck to a nonviolent mean. And then if you look at Mahatma Gandhi, of course, he was from a Hindu tradition, but a Hindu tradition influenced by Buddhism. It was very much about using nonviolent methods, avoiding conflict to move things forward. Very much an anti-war approach. I have one piece of music by a Tibetan singer, also a little bit hybrid, Western, Eastern, to make it easier for you to listen to, but very beautiful. And you can see here, it's very much in the power of the Buddhism that I know to inspire peace. So the last piece by Yongchen Lama. This does have a little bit of film to it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you could watch that for a long time. It's exceptionally beautiful. We can share the YouTube clips after. But I mean, that in the spirit of Unitarianism, we could see the value of light, and that the prayer wheels, if you're familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, is these wheels have prayers in them, and by turning them, you're bringing prayers into the ether, into the universe. And then there also in that image, there was the prayer flags, which I lived amongst in Bhutan for many, many years. And the idea is that prayers are written on the flags, and as the wind blows. So, and you may not literally believe it, but the ideas behind it are truly, truly beautiful. In the case of Buddhism, I'll use another example. Going back to King Duttagamanu, who I talked about earlier, who was the sort of Buddhist conqueror of Sri Lanka. When I was in Sri Lanka, it was during one of the most difficult periods of history. There was another period that was very bad in 1990. It was the end of the Civil War for 30 years, and it ended brutally. There were hundreds of thousands of people displaced, and we were in the middle of it, and we always were trying to find space to build peace, which we weren't very successful with, space to help people, which we were more successful with, and space to rebuild and build peace sort of after the war, which we had some success with. I gave a talk at McGill just now, and I gave a report card, and I said on peace we got an F, on humanitarian we got a B, and maybe on sort of post-war rebuilding we got maybe a B- or a C+ for the work that we were involved with. But one of the things that strangely worked was in the early stages of the war, I think through it was the World Buddhist Union or a similar organization, was trying to reach out to the monk body in Sri Lanka to try to build confidence and try to actually help facilitate at least humanitarian work. And I was invited along to the session at the particular temple that is associated with King Duttagamanu. So the king who is in a sense the symbol of the conquest of Sri Lanka by the Sinhalese, the king which the former Sri Lankan president, who I had a good working relationship with, Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa, not the more recent one, Gotabaya. People said, he didn't, but people said he was like the reincarnation of this King Duttagamanu because he had won the war and made Sri Lanka Buddhist again. So this particular monk was from a family that actually had been displaced and had been attacked by Tamil tigers, but he had sort of reached out. He was like on the middle way, because in Sri Lanka you had monks who were aggressively nationalists, saying Sri Lanka is the promised land for Buddhism and nobody else should be there and anything is justified to keep it Buddhist. And then you had other monks, like we call them the peace monks, who are more in the line of the Dalai Lama, even though that's a different school of Buddhism. And this guy was in the middle. So he had the voice and somehow I spent that day with him and a lot of other people discussing things. And then because I was traveling north all the time to the areas affected by conflict, I would drive through his place. So I usually would stop either on the way back or on the way up and have a chat with him. And we became friends. I don't want to exaggerate, but I think we really became friends. And it made a huge difference actually to the work, because he used his position to advocate for peace in that situation, not to stop the war. I think that was beyond anything at that moment, but it did help us have access to people who were fleeing the war at early stages. It did help us facilitate programs that allowed the hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced to return much sooner than had been the government's original plan. And one of the nice things of my career was actually getting to know this person. And I know that in various forums he had advocated on our behalf, because there was a range of views amongst the senior monks of the country. Some were very peace-oriented, some were very war-oriented, and he helped give that space. And sometimes I would meet these generals, and they say, I just was in this place, and I met this monk, and he said he knows you. And it opened doors for me that they saw that I had a link with this religious figure who was important and symbolically was important because he was the monk of the temple of King Tutugemenu. So I just use that as an example of how engagement with faith and religion can make a difference. So just coming to the end, what about the future? So right now, we have this situation where there's, on one hand, huge problems. The biggest, I feel, are coming from climate change, but the problems from climate change, such as in Pakistan, actually accentuate the other problems that partly come from the years of COVID, partly come from earlier trends where you have reversals in development progress. I've been very involved with something called the Human Development Report since 1990. And that was generally a report that would say, well, the world is getting better, but this, and that is still wrong. But the last few years, actually, they said the world's not getting better. The Human Development Index actually had gone backwards for the first time since they started measuring it in sort of the late 1980s. So you've got that confluence of climate change, greater inequalities within countries and among countries. And then you have a polarization in society that's also much stronger, both within societies, as was most apparent from the neighbor to the north of here in Detroit and in the United States, mainly to the south of Canada, but also true in Canada with the blockade of the Ambassador Bridge. I mean, you can go on the right or wrong of it, but just the level of polarization. And you can make an argument that religion, social media has made some of that polarization worse. I'm not going to go into too many examples, but one from Pakistan. When I was there, there was a blasphemy trial, lots of blasphemy trials, because it's a very emotive thing in Pakistan that if you somehow say something critical of the Prophet or of the Quran, that it's considered a capital offense, and many people, I wouldn't say the majority, but many people get very emotional about it. And this is sort of turbocharged by social media now, so it gets much worse. And there's certainly examples from North America as well. In Sri Lanka, I mean, I was exposed to the early examples of social media doing bad things in that. I'm probably talking a bit too long, but one little story. When I first came to Sri Lanka, I went out to meet a number of Buddhist monks who were protesting at that point what the military was doing in Myanmar. And they wanted to present me a petition. I was just there about a month. So I thought, this is a good thing. I can accept a petition. I accepted the petition. They then took a photograph. One of the press photographers took a very powerful photograph of me accepting this petition, but framed by these two fairly heavy senior monks with their bald heads. And so I was framed in my nice light colored suit by these two monks, and it became the Yahoo picture of the day. So nice. I didn't know that. But then all these comments started to come on the picture of, you know, who is this terrible guy? Who is this white tiger? White tiger is a name for people who support the Tamil Tigers. And it made me aware, mainly through my brother who picked it up, I hadn't picked it up, of the power of social media, even in 2007. Now it's much, much more. At the same time, you know, this social media and the technologies we have mean that we can do something about climate change. Not easy, but we can. All the windmills of Essex County, if nothing else. In terms of you know, what happened in Sri Lanka, coming back to Sri Lanka, which has gone through terrible times because of exposure to debt, inequality, COVID, tourism, climate change. But you know, people came together, and this is the nicest example, and perhaps I'll conclude with this. It was about 7-8 months ago, they had this massive protest which forced the president, Rajapaksa as well, albeit his brother, Gotabaya, to resign. And they were in front of the presidency. At this time of year, it was Ramadan, and you had everybody having iftar together. Now, iftar is a Muslim tradition where when you're fasting, at the end of the fast, you come together with, ideally with family members and community. It's a real community thing, and you break fast together. And everybody broke fast together with the Muslims. Now, that wouldn't have happened in Sri Lanka before, but because of some of this power, positive power, you could say, of social media, other things, as well as philosophy. They're able to bring people together who weren't together. So I hope that can be the vision for the future. But you need to have groups like yours that go back to the 1880s that fought fire and brimstone. You need to have groups that basically support what is in line with your creed. So I think it is true. You say that, and we said it earlier, the church was founded on the faith that love is more positive force for good than fear. This exists as a haven of religious freedom, offering fellowship, knowledge, and inspiration to all who would seek truth, live responsibly and courageously. We have to find ways in which the new technologies, the new ways of living can help more people seek truth, live responsibly and courageously. And I think people make wars, but faith can be an important tool to end them. Thank you. So I think I'll pass to Ray. Yeah.
Thank you, Neil, for very interesting and stimulating talk. We've gone a little over time, but if does anyone have questions for? Well, I'm going to limit it to 2-3 questions at the most. Yes, Ken. Do you want to come up and use the microphone?
Ray, do you want her to?
Yeah, stop the recording, please. Hold it close to your mouth.
Thank you. My question is Unitarian Universalism